Karen Sims from the Trauma and Resiliency Initiative, and we are happy that you're tuning into the CU Try Show. The Trauma and Resiliency Initiative is a local not-for-profit and a working group, and we've been working with Champaign County to make it a trauma-informed community. We receive funding from the Mental Health Board and the Champaign County Community Coalition. And we are really, really lucky and fortunate today to have, and of course time has passed, Osajuli Cravens.
Osajuli
Cravens, the Marketing and Communications Manager from Courage Connections with us. It is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and so we're going to have a long conversation about that. But before I say that, I just want to also remind you that the views and opinions of our guests are their own, and so they don't reflect our funding, but we definitely kind of vet them to make sure that they communicate good information. So I trust we'll have a really great conversation. And if you are watching this show live or even afterwards, Mrs. Cravens will provide resources about how to stay in touch with Courage Connections, so that information will be available. But if you're watching it live, there's the Facebook chat, so please send questions and all of that, because we want to make this interactive. So welcome. Tell me a little bit. We were chatting right before the show launched. I am so happy you were able to be here to kick off Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so tell me a little bit about yourself and Courage Connections.
Yeah, sure. So like I was telling you before the show started, today is actually my 6th anniversary of joining the agency. So I've been there for 6 years. I started working at we no longer have it, but our resale store, just part-time, and just expressed more interest in the agency. And so moved from that to a development assistant, and now marketing and communications manager. So it has been a lovely journey. Definitely very passionate about our cause. I've had several family members experience domestic violence, and it is just something that is really, really true to my soul. I always tell people when I go out into the community, I would love to work myself out of a job. It's a goal that we end domestic violence, and we kind of take the normalization out of it. This organization is one of many that have been one of the first, not only in Illinois, but in the country. So it has a long history of helping people and changing those norms. We've been around for almost 50 years. So we've been a part of that just social change in our country. So I think that's something for, celebrating my 6 years and coming up for 50 with the agency, that's something that all of us are extremely proud of.
So I would hope that a lot of people are aware that it's a resource in the community. So tell me a little bit about Courage Connections and what you do, because you sort of I loved the full introduction, but just in case, so that people really are aware of it as a resource, but also, you're right, the unique history of Courage Connections in this community. And then I have a couple, definitely more questions, because I want you to unpack the whole domestic violence piece, but just tell me about Courage Connections first.
Okay, so like I mentioned, we started in 1971. It was most people in our community know us as A Woman's Place, or perhaps the Center for Women in Transition. So those two agencies started at different times. Center for Women in Transition started in 1986. And so they were focused on helping women who were, and children who were experiencing homelessness. But through the years, what we found was a lot of those women who were experiencing homelessness, it was because of domestic violence, or there was an underlying issue with domestic violence. And so in 2014, we had merged in 2010, and then changed our name in 2014 to Courage Connection, to encompass all that we do.
Mm.
So we help, like I said, anyone who's been affected with domestic violence, and it's not just women anymore. Through the years, we have learned that men suffer from domestic violence. People in the LGBTQ community have effects with domestic violence. So that name change was very important because we wanted to encompass everyone.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So right, you opened the door. So tell me, I said it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. There are a lot of misconceptualizations about what that means. Can you describe like what domestic violence is so that the audience kind of has a clear picture of what you're talking about? Because again, sometimes people only think about the movie version, and I know it has a lot of different complexities.
Yeah, so the basic definition of domestic violence, and it's basically anyone, or sorry, let me back up because I'm going to paraphrase and not do the exact definition, but it's a pattern of coercive behavior that one person puts on another person to control them. So that could be intimate partner relationship, that could be someone in your household. So you could be a parent with an adult child that is abusive towards you. You could be roommates, and could be considered domestic violence. It's also something that affects everyone. There's no like rich, poor, it's all socioeconomical backgrounds. So there's a misconception that people often feel that, oh, well, this is not my problem. This is something that happens in a poor community or this type of community compared to mine. It happens to everyone. So.
And it sounds like the thing that ties it all together are those feelings of coercion, those feelings of powerless, having one person. And so it can maybe take, right, financial forms or sexual forms or a lot of different forms. It doesn't just mean like someone is actually engaged in physical violence. It could just be it could be a whole alphabet soup of behaviors where you feel silenced and oppressed in sort of your household.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned like that movie behavior. Often people will are actually quite shocked that we talk about financial abuse or we talk about spiritual abuse, and people don't realize that someone can control you because of your own beliefs, or they can strip you of those beliefs, and that's another type of very abusive behavior, and another form of control. And just stopping you from being your true self is once again abusive.
Yeah.
It's not something that should be tolerated, and I think that that's why often people don't know that they're in an abusive situation, because they're so used to seeing like, oh, if you have a bruise, or oh, well, he just talks this way, or that's how I was raised, my parents talk the same way, and know that that's abuse.
Yeah.
So it's important that people know that, so they can realize, maybe these feelings of depression and loneliness are because they're being abused.
Yeah. And so you're hinting at something that I hope people really hear is that if it feels uncomfortable, if it feels painful, if sometimes it's you just sort of feeling lots of feelings like a powerlessness.
Yeah.
And if you're in those environments, sometimes those are signs that your relationship status and relationships broad and deep are silencing you, and you should seek support. And I know you're going to talk about what you recommend for people. But before we do that, we're going to make that a cliffhanger. I'm imagining in this day and age, because I kind of have previewed some of the work, because we do some work around crime victims. There was a lot of dialogue in the beginning of the COVID crisis that it sort of unfolded that people were fearful that there would be escalating calls and needs for services because people were in situations where there were more financial pressures and physical pressures, and people would have less mobility to move. Are you seeing that? And can you say more about that? Did those fears sort of materialize, or was it all just sort of, made up?
No, I definitely had a conversation with one of our counselors and therapists recently, that they're all very busy right now. If you can imagine, counseling just in general is always something that anyone who's gone through domestic violence, it's highly recommended that they seek that help with their mental health. And one thing that was going on with COVID, I know in my own personal home, we had it pretty hard, just being with everyone. So if you can imagine, someone who might have already had all heightened tensions and fear and isolation, all of that was elevated. We didn't necessarily, for us, and I know different shelters around Illinois and around the United States had different experiences with this, but we didn't overall see a huge rise in the beginning. We were pretty full. To make sure that everyone's safe, we did utilize hotel spaces and things like that, to make sure they were not only safe from their abusive situations, but safe for COVID as well. But we definitely saw a rise in needing to get orders of protection, those counseling calls, different types of service calls. Some of the people who have maybe been away from a domestic violence situation for some time, those feelings of isolation came back. One of the ways to abuse someone is to keep them from their friends and family and to keep them in their house. So those feelings of isolation were all coming back. So we've definitely seen that happen, and we were able to jump into action and provide telehealth. Our court advocates stayed where they can be connected, and as soon as we could go back into the courthouse, we were. So that's something that I have to say our staff are truly amazing, because when it was a call to action, they jumped right in and we figured it out.
That must be so reassuring. And I hope people really hear that services are available. They didn't shut down. Actually, you guys are bending and being flexible to be accommodating. And so for people who are out there wondering kind of what would happen, you're saying call and take advantage, and we will be available to you.
Yeah, we actually had a counselor. With my job, I get to talk to so many of my colleagues, and I always tell them they're my fuel so that I can go out and share the work that they're doing. But she had a client, and they are, sometimes you need to have that face-to-face interaction. So they're able to find places publicly where they can interact and meet, now that we aren't at home, have a stay-at-home order anymore. So I was really, really happy to hear that sometimes you do need that face-to-face, and we're able to figure out ways to still do that.
Wow, that's wonderful. So in addition to COVID stressors, there have been a lot of like social and cultural issues happening. Has that shown up and impacted your work, the people that you serve? Yeah, so in terms of domestic violence, I'm just thinking about those feelings of powerlessness that might aggravate things. Have you seen anything?
Yeah, not only with our community, but definitely on a national spectrum. People of color are having a hard time with calling law enforcement when they are faced with a domestic violence situation. And it's always hard. I know it's hard for law enforcement as well. Domestic violence calls are one of the most dangerous calls for law enforcement. But what was happening is that, or what still is happening, is that people in these relationships, even though it might be abusive, you're in a relationship because you love that person and you want to be with them. So calling the police officer, and that you are with a person of color, whether you're African American or Latino, or you you fear that
Mhm.
it's not just going to be an arrest.
Yeah.
So people are holding back from calling. And, that's something that I know we don't really know how to address. And that's keeping people, just like COVID kept people from calling because, oh, I don't want to live in a shelter situation. I'm scared of getting sick. You also had, or also have, well, maybe I'm not going to call the police because I just want this person to go to jail or to calm down for the night. I don't necessarily want them to die.
Yeah.
So those fears are real, and it's there. And we also have staff that, you know, we're humans too, and this is
Yeah.
affecting us, and we want to make sure that everyone's comfortable. And our agency has done a really good job at trying to be as available to not only our clients but our staff too, to make sure that if we're not good, we can't
Yeah.
do our job for other people. So it's been a challenge, but once again, I think we're trying to rise to the occasion and do as much as possible, and educate ourselves.
Yeah.
We're in the process of doing some much needed education on cultural sensitivities and cultural awarenesses right now. So we're trying.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people don't, who aren't aware of the history of Courage Connection when it was a woman's fund, may not know that it was, part of the initial mission was to sort of tackle oppression and injustice. And so it was, sort of a women's rights organization, and a
Yeah.
people's rights and an anti-oppression organization. And so for people who want to like only look at the sliver and not look at the whole, what I love how you're articulating, like you guys are looking at the whole. Do you have like, I know I'm going to put you on, like to ask you to sort of think on the fly, but do you have advice if I'm a family member or somebody who is thinking through those dynamics, like, hey, how do I weigh my commitment to sort of my own safety with my commitment to the people I love and serve, even though that there is injustice and right, like inequities and legitimate fears? What would you say, or what would you advise, or maybe even a partner organization? What could we do to address that?
I think one of the biggest things that we're learning in our own agency is communication. I won't get too much into it, but we not only are doing this exercise where we're reading a book and having dialogue with each other, but we had an open discussion that all of us came to via Zoom, all came together and talked about our fears and grievances and what was going on in our heads at that moment. And it was very, I think, eye-opening and enlightening for a lot of us, because you work with people every day that maybe think a little bit differently than you do, or maybe have had fears that you don't understand. So definitely having open dialogue is important, and being willing. I was watching a TED talk the other day, and it was about listening, and it was, just like when you listen, don't wait for your chance to speak. Make sure that you're hearing and waiting for an opportunity to exchange thoughts and ideas. And I think that unfortunately in our society, we're not doing that enough. And definitely feeling comfortable enough to ask hard questions and be willing to understand those answers, and because sometimes those answers aren't going to be so great when you get them. They're going to might sting a little bit, but we're not going to get anywhere if we don't talk to each other and educate each other. Yeah.
And so it sounds like on multiple different levels, you're asking for people who might be impacted by domestic violence to talk, to reach out, to have these conversations, for people who are providers, who are helping them to open up conversations, and for people broad and deep in the community to be aware that there are cultural values. So sometimes the just leave or don't leave is far more complex than a lot of times that people give, right, like give credence to. And so to be aware that there are these larger variables that people are sort of attending to and being challenged by.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely, we when we're doing our trainings and stuff, we talk about like the myths, and one of the big myths are, this is a private family matter, or this is something's going on with my neighbor. It's not necessarily, something that I should get involved in, but we need to understand that it affects all of us. That person who's in an abusive situation is going to go to work, and they might not be 100% there because of all the stresses that are going on in their life at home and how that's going to affect them. Or maybe that child in the classroom that's a little bit aggressive, or that doesn't want to, is the exact opposite, it's an introvert. That could be because of what's happening in the home. So in some kind of way, it's going to affect all of us. So, the more that we know about it, and the more that we're willing to talk about it. We often say, some of our colleagues, or some of my colleagues, that we're horrible at parties.
Why so? Say more.
Yeah, I'm sure you understand that.
But go ahead and say it out loud.
We're just, because we start talking about stuff, and we might, someone might tell us a story, or sometimes we're hesitant to say what we do, because then someone will disclose to us. It happens to me all the time. If I'm always wearing something that has Courage Connection on it, and someone will tell me, anything from being at Michael's to Walmart. Somebody would tell me what has happened in their life, or how can I get help, or how can I help my daughter, or how can I help my friend. So it's something that is out there, and it's everywhere, and we just don't realize it.
I think I really appreciate you elevating that, because I think sometimes you're right. You said this in the beginning. People think like it's something that happens to a small group of people or a certain demographic, and domestic violence is so prevalent and so common, and so, right, like, and so insidious, right? Like, it's really hard. Given that, are there populations, or, and I hate to talk about that, but are there like areas of the community that you feel are not like having unique experiences with domestic violence, like perhaps rural communities, or the LGBTQ community, or any of those things? Are there unique populations or unique needs? And I hate the populations thing. It doesn't resonate with me, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, definitely. If you think about people, well, I'll try to touch on both of those that you mentioned with the LGBTQ community. Most of the time, especially in an area like ours in Champaign-Urbana, most people kind of know each other, because you seek people who are like you. And so sometimes it's hard because your circle is so small. So if you, some people might feel if they speak out, that they're going to be condemning somebody within their community, and also people just don't tend to think that this is happening within a male-male relationship, or male-female relationship, or somebody that is gender non-binary, that they aren't experiencing these things. And like I said in the beginning, everybody experiences this, unfortunately. You're dealing with people. This is not an anger management issue. This is someone who's choosing to isolate and control someone else. So that can happen to multiple people, and in multiple groups. And as far as the rural community goes, once again, it's that small community, and sometimes there's already barriers of phone services don't work all that well. Sometimes in rural communities, there's not public transportation. It's harder to get to places like Courage Connection and find shelter, or you're kind of in between maybe a county or two, so you don't know where to go. Court is not as accessible to a lot of people in those rural communities as it is if you're staying in an urban area. So those barriers that we face in town are sometimes even more heightened when you're in a smaller community. And the fear of, everybody. So, everybody's going to know your business, or that police officer that shows up to your house is a good friend with the abuser, and they're going to tell you to just work it out or something like that. So there's definitely barriers in both of those things that you've talked about.
So I guess I want to say, I feel like we've covered a lot of things. I want to kind of give this before we talk about solutions and strategies, because I know you want to make sure people know where to find resources. Are there myths or misconceptualizations that you've hinted at some, but are there myths that you really want to sort of highlight? For example, right, like you've touched on some, but I want to give you a chance to sort of say them again.
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing I talked about was, this is not like an anger management type thing. And I think a lot of people often have that in their head that, oh, someone flew off the handle one time, or if this person didn't like, it happens a lot with women, but if she would just learn how to speak to him, or she could just not push their buttons, not go there, then that's the thing that would save them, or not send him flying off the handle. But the truth is, if you see most people that are abusers, they are not going to go off on their boss. They might have a boss that talks to them any kind of way and is belittling to them, but they know how to suppress their anger when it comes to not punching them or not, cursing at them. But they might come home and take those aggressions out on the person that they've said they loved. So, it is the controlled, what they're doing is all about control, because they know that they can control that person, and they might be feeling or having feelings of anger, but they know where to direct them, because they can exude all of their power and control over this one person, and they can control them instead of controlling the world around them. So, it is not about one time anger. If it happens once, and it's most likely going to happen again, there's going to be escalations. Maybe it's just making fun of someone, or saying rude and crude things, holding them in isolation, and that over time might lead to physical abuse. It may never lead to the physical abuse, but sometimes those words can be extremely damaging, especially if you have children around. And so it could definitely leave a mark that lasts for a long time.